When you look at a map of the world, one country dominates: Russia. It is simply vast, stretching across 11 time zones from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It covers over 1/8 of the Earth's inhabited land area. But it wasn't always this way. This immense size is not a geographical accident. It is the direct result of a relentless, centuries-long story of conquest, ambition, and expansion. The question of how Russia became so enormous is one of the great stories of world history. It's a tale filled with ambitious czars, fearless adventurers, and the brutal subjugation of countless peoples. The origins of this colossal state lie not in ancient times, but in a relatively small principality centered on Moscow that began to look outwards with an insatiable hunger for land and resources. This story of incredible growth really kicks off in the 16th century. Before then, the Grand Duchy of Moscow was just one of several Russian-speaking states, often paying tribute to the powerful Mongol successor states to its south and east. But a new sense of destiny was emerging. The rulers in Moscow began to see themselves as the rightful heirs to a unified Russian land, and they had the military and political will to make that vision a reality. This wasn't a gentle or peaceful process of settlement. It was a history written in blood and iron, driven by a desire for security, wealth, and imperial glory. The expansion was systematic, aggressive, and incredibly fast, changing the map of the world forever. The process began by looking east. For centuries, the Russian principalities had been dominated by the Golden Horde and its successor states, the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia. These were formidable powers, controlling vital trade routes and frequently raiding Russian lands. For Moscow to truly become a great power, it had to break this stranglehold. This meant direct confrontation. The Muscovite state started to build a formidable army, one that was increasingly equipped with modern technology like firearms and cannons. This technological edge would prove decisive in the coming conflicts, giving the Muscovites a power that their rivals often struggled to match, setting the stage for an unstoppable wave of expansion. Understanding this history is key to understanding modern Russia. The methods of control, the relationship with its diverse ethnic groups, and its sheer scale are all legacies of this period of dramatic growth. The empire was built on a foundation of military conquest, followed by the extraction of resources and the imposition of a new political order. Local peoples were often forced to pay tribute, their lands were seized, and their cultures were suppressed. This created a complex and often fraught relationship between the center in Moscow and the vast peripheries it controlled. The story of Russia's size is, therefore, the story of how a small, ambitious state transformed itself into a continent-spanning empire. The first great leap in Russia's eastward expansion was orchestrated by one of its most formidable and feared rulers, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Crowned the first Tsar of all Russia, Ivan was determined to crush the powers that had long threatened his domain. His primary target was the Khanate of Kazan, a powerful Tatar state located on the Volga River. Kazan was more than just a rival, it was a constant threat, launching raids deep into Muscovite territory for slaves and plunder. For Ivan, conquering Kazan was a matter of security, prestige, and religious destiny. He saw it as a holy war, a crusade to reclaim Christian lands and subjects from Muslim rule. This was to be the defining campaign of his early reign. Ivan's initial attempts to take Kazan failed, but he was a man of immense determination. For his final campaign in 1552, he assembled a massive army, reportedly over 150,000 strong, equipped with the latest military technology. He brought in foreign engineers to assist with siege warfare, and his forces possessed a powerful artillery train that the Tatars of Kazan could not hope to match. The siege of the city was a brutal, drawn-out affair. The defenders of Kazan fought with incredible bravery, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Ivan's army encircled the city, cutting off all supplies and relentlessly bombarding its walls with cannon fire. The final assault was a scene of horrific violence as Russian troops stormed the breached walls and fought their way through the streets. The fall of Kazan was a pivotal moment in Russian history. It marked the first time a non-Slavic state had been permanently conquered and annexed by Moscow. The victory was celebrated with immense fanfare back in the capital. To commemorate it, Ivan commissioned the construction of one of Russia's most iconic buildings, St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Its vibrant, onion-shaped domes were meant to symbolize the triumph of Russian Orthodoxy over Islam and the unification of new lands under the Tsar's rule. The conquest sent a powerful message to Russia's other rivals. The era of Tatar dominance was over, and a new, formidable power was on the rise. For the people of Kazan, the conquest was a catastrophe. The city was sacked, and a large portion of its population was massacred. In the aftermath, the Russian authorities implemented a policy of forced conversion to Orthodox Christianity and colonization. Tatar nobles who converted were allowed to keep some of their status, but the general population faced immense pressure. Mosques were destroyed and replaced with churches. Russian peasants were moved onto the most fertile lands, displacing the local Tatar population. This set a grim precedent for how the Russian state would deal with conquered peoples in its subsequent expansion, a pattern of military victory followed by political and cultural subjugation. With Kazan now firmly under his control, Ivan the Terrible turned his attention to the next major obstacle on the Volga River, the Khanate of Astrakhan. Located at the mouth of the Volga where it flows into the Caspian Sea, Astrakhan was a vital hub for trade. It controlled the routes connecting Russia to Persia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Capturing it would not only eliminate another successor state of the Golden Horde, but would also give Moscow complete control over the entire length of the Volga, Europe's longest river. This wasn't just about military security, it was about economic dominance. The Tsar and his merchants dreamed of the immense wealth that could be gained from controlling these ancient trade networks. The conquest of Astrakhan in 1556 was far easier than the brutal siege of Kazan. The Astrakhan Khanate was weaker and more politically divided. Learning from the fate of Kazan, the rulers of Astrakhan offered little resistance. When the Russian army approached, the ruling Khan fled, and the city surrendered almost without a fight. The speed of this victory demonstrated the growing power and confidence of the Muscovite state. In just 4 years, Ivan had shattered 2 of the great Tatar Khanates, breaking their power forever and fundamentally redrawing the political map of Eastern Europe. Russia now had a secure southern frontier on the Caspian Sea, opening up a new world of commercial and diplomatic possibilities. The annexation of Astrakhan had profound economic consequences. With the entire Volga River now a Russian artery of trade, goods could flow uninterrupted from the forests of the north to the markets of the south. Russian merchants, alongside Armenian, Persian, and Indian traders, flocked to the city, transforming it into a bustling, multicultural commercial center. This new access to the Caspian Sea and beyond fueled the Russian economy, enriching the Tsar's treasury and the powerful merchant families who financed further expeditions. The wealth generated from this trade would become a crucial engine for the state's next great push, the incredibly ambitious and lucrative conquest of Siberia. For the local people, the Nogai Tatars and others who had lived under the Khanate, the arrival of Russian rule brought immense change. Just as in Kazan, the new authorities encouraged Russian settlement and the establishment of the Orthodox Church, while Astrakhan remained a more diverse and tolerant city than Kazan due to its commercial importance. The political power was now firmly in Russian hands. The conquest was a clear statement of intent. Moscow was no longer a regional power content to defend its borders. It was now an expansionist empire, looking ever eastward, with its sights set on the seemingly endless resource-rich lands that lay beyond the Ural Mountains. The fall of Kazan and Astrakhan opened the door to the east, but the true prize lay beyond the Ural Mountains, Siberia. This vast territory, larger than the entire continent of Europe, was known to be rich in what was then called soft gold, the luxurious furs of sable, fox, and ermine. The demand for these furs in Europe was insatiable, and the profits were astronomical. The powerful Stroganov merchant family, who had been granted lands in the Urals by Ivan the Terrible, saw a huge opportunity. They hired a band of Cossacks, led by a formidable and controversial figure named Yermak Timofeyevich, to launch a private military expedition into the Siberian Khanate to secure the fur trade for themselves and for the Tsar. Yermak and his small army of around 840 Cossacks were hardened frontiersmen, accustomed to fighting and survival. Although they were vastly outnumbered by the forces of the Siberian Khan, Kuchum Khan, they had a crucial advantage: firearms. The Cossacks' muskets and small cannons terrified the Siberian warriors, who fought primarily with bows, arrows, and spears. In 1582, Yermak's expedition confronted the main Siberian army near the capital, Kashlik. The noise and smoke of the Cossack guns created chaos, and despite fierce resistance, the Siberian forces were routed. Yermak captured Kashlik, forcing Kuchum Khan to flee into the vast wilderness. It was a stunning victory, achieved by a tiny force deep within enemy territory. The news of Yermak's success reached Ivan the Terrible in Moscow. The Tsar, who had initially been wary of the Stroganovs' private war, was overjoyed. He saw the immense potential of this new territory and immediately sent reinforcements to support the Cossacks. Yermak was pardoned for his past crimes. He had been a river pirate and hailed as a hero. His expedition, which had started as a private commercial venture, was now an official state project of imperial expansion. Yermak himself did not live to see the full conquest. He was killed in a surprise raid a few years later. But he had broken the back of the Siberian Khanate and blazed a trail for others to follow. Yermak's campaign set the pattern for the Russian conquest of Siberia. It would be led not by massive state armies, but by small mobile groups of Cossacks, fur trappers, and adventurers, all pushing eastward in search of fortune. They moved with incredible speed, traveling along Siberia's great river systems, the Ob, the Yenisei, the Lena, which served as natural highways through the dense forests. They were driven by the lure of fur and supported by the state, which demanded that all conquered peoples pay a tribute, known as the yasak, in furs. This alliance of private greed and state ambition fueled a relentless advance that would, in just a few decades, carry the Russian flag all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The Russian advance across Siberia after Yermak's initial conquest can be described as a fur rush, an explosion of activity driven by the incredible profits of the fur trade. This was the engine of empire. Cossacks, trappers, and merchants pushed relentlessly eastward, following the paths of sable and fox. Their method of control was simple and effective. Upon entering a new territory, they would locate the local tribes, such as the Khanty, Mansi, and Evenks, and demand their submission to the Tsar. This submission was formalized through the payment of the yasak, a mandatory annual tribute paid in the finest furs. To enforce this, the Russians would often take hostages from the local elite, ensuring the tribes delivered their quota each year. To secure their hold on this vast and often hostile land, the Russians built a network of forts, or ostrogs. These were simple wooden fortresses, often constructed at strategic locations like river junctions, and they served as centers of administration, trade, and military power. From these forts, tribute collectors would venture out to gather the yasak, and fur traders would barter goods like metal tools, cloth, and alcohol for additional pelts. Towns like Tobolsk, Tomsk, and Yakutsk grew up around these forts, becoming the new centers of Russian power in Siberia. This chain of fortified settlements created a line of control that crept steadily across the continent, solidifying the Tsar's claim to the land. The process was far from peaceful. Many indigenous Siberian peoples did not submit willingly to Russian rule. The imposition of the yasak, the taking of hostages, and the often brutal behavior of the tribute collectors led to frequent and violent uprisings. Tribes would attack Russian forts, ambush fur-gathering parties, and refuse to pay the tribute. However, these acts of resistance were almost always crushed. The Russians' technological superiority, particularly their firearms, gave them a decisive military advantage over local warriors armed with traditional weapons. Furthermore, the Russian state was methodical and unforgiving. If one group of soldiers was wiped out, another would be sent to exact revenge and reimpose control. The impact on the indigenous peoples of Siberia was devastating. Beyond the violence of the conquest, they were exposed to new diseases like smallpox, to which they had no immunity, leading to catastrophic population declines. The relentless demand for fur also disrupted their traditional economies and ways of life, which were often based on subsistence hunting and herding. The arrival of Russian settlers, Orthodox missionaries, and state officials further eroded their cultural autonomy. While some individuals found ways to profit from the new order, for the majority, the Russian conquest meant the loss of their land, their independence, and their traditional world. As the Russian advance surged across Siberia throughout the 17th century, it was perhaps inevitable that it would eventually run into another great power expanding from a different direction. By the 1640s, Russian Cossacks and adventurers had reached the Amur River basin, a fertile and strategically important region on the edge of the Pacific. This area, however, was considered part of the sphere of influence of the newly established Qing dynasty in China. The Chinese, under the formidable Kangxi Emperor, viewed the Russian presence as an intrusion into their northern frontier and a threat to their own interests in the region. The stage was set for a direct confrontation between two expanding empires. The conflict centered on the Russian fort of Albazin, which was built on the Amur River in territory the Qing claimed as their own. For several decades, the two powers engaged in a series of skirmishes and sieges. The Qing army, much larger and well-organized, repeatedly besieged the Russian outpost. The Cossack defenders, though vastly outnumbered, put up a fierce resistance, using their fortifications and firearms to hold off the Chinese forces. However, it became clear to both sides that a full-scale war in such a remote region would be incredibly costly and difficult for either empire to sustain. Diplomacy became the only viable path forward. This led to the signing of the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. This was a landmark agreement, not only because it was the first treaty between Russia and China, but also because it was negotiated on equal terms, with Latin used as a neutral language for diplomatic exchange. The treaty established a formal border between the two empires. Russia agreed to withdraw from the Amur River Valley and destroy its fort at Albazin. In return, China recognized Russian control over the vast territories north of the Amur and opened up formal trade relations. This treaty effectively halted Russia's expansion into this part of East Asia for nearly 200 years. The Treaty of Nerchinsk was a moment of pragmatic compromise. For Russia, it secured the gains it had made across the rest of Siberia and provided lucrative new trade opportunities with China. For the Qing dynasty, it secured their northern frontier and removed the threat of a rival power encroaching on their Manchurian homeland. It demonstrated the limits of Russia's eastward push. While it could overwhelm smaller tribal societies, it could not simply roll over a powerful and sophisticated state like Qing China. The treaty established a relatively stable border and a relationship that, while sometimes tense, would define the geopolitics of Northeast Asia for centuries to come. By the end of the 17th century, Russia controlled a vast territory stretching to the Pacific, but it was still a loosely governed and somewhat chaotic domain. The ruler who would change this, forging the sprawling lands into a more cohesive and powerful empire, was Peter the Great. Peter ascended to the throne in 1682 and launched a revolutionary program of modernization. He was obsessed with turning Russia into a major European power, and he understood that this required a strong, centralized state, a modern army, and a robust economy. His reforms would have a profound impact on how the massive empire, including its newly acquired Siberian territories, was governed. Peter the Great fundamentally reformed the administration of the state. He replaced the old haphazard systems of governance with a more rational, bureaucratic structure modeled on Western European states. For Siberia, this meant the end of the freewheeling era of Cossack-led expansion. The region was formally incorporated into the empire, divided into provinces, and placed under the authority of royally appointed governors. State control was tightened, and the process of exploiting Siberia's resources became more systematic. The fur tribute, the yasak, was regularized, but Peter also sought new sources of wealth, initiating state-sponsored exploration for mineral resources like silver and iron ore. To fund his ambitious military campaigns and modernization projects, Peter imposed heavy taxes on the entire population, including the peoples of Siberia. The old system of tribute paid in furs was increasingly supplemented or replaced by cash taxes, which forced many indigenous people into new economic relationships with the Russian state and market. This created new hardships and further eroded their traditional lifestyles. Peter's government was far more intrusive and demanding than what had come before. He wanted to know everything about his empire and its resources, commissioning expeditions to map the vast territories and catalog their peoples and wealth, all in the service of strengthening the state. In conclusion, the immense size of Russia today is the direct legacy of this period of unstoppable expansion. It began with Ivan the Terrible's strategic conquests of Kazan and Astrakhan, which broke the power of the Tatar Khanates and opened the way east. It was then propelled across a continent by the Cossack-led Fur Rush, a brutal but effective campaign of conquest that established Russian control over Siberia in a remarkably short time. Finally, rulers like Peter the Great consolidated these gains, transforming a sprawling conquered territory into an integrated part of a powerful, centralized Russian empire. This epic and often violent story of ambition and conquest is the untold history behind Russia's place on the world map.